Thank you, Helmut. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I hope you can hear me, and I'm very sorry that I cannot be there in person, but there was a mess with traveling. I mean, we had already the story that we are in a critical phase. We are leaving the Anthropocene, and we have to find a safe and just corridor for our planet and humankind. And it's a very short period now if we are going in an unsafe or in a safe future. So we have to do everything that the Anthropocene is not becoming the shortest epoch of Earth's history. And we see that there are key risks, and these are the 10 top risks for the next 10 years based on the World Economic Forum. And the first 4 risks are all related to environmental risks, primarily climate change and the related increase, for example, of extreme weather events and biodiversity loss. And of course, these risks cannot be considered in isolation and separation. They are intertwined and they are interacting in a strong way. We have seen similar graphs, and you have seen many of them, and we just heard a very fascinating talk by Gerhard. This is the increase of the CO2 concentration and the increase in temperature. And what we have every 5 to 10 years, we have a huge international agreement. But we do not see a leveling off of the CO2 concentrations. Indeed, there are more than 300,000 international agreements, but most of them do not work, because if you have no way to empower and have sanctions, they are not very effective. The second aspect, which is not shown here on the graph, is that we have, during the same period, we have an exponential increase in data, in information, and partly also in knowledge. And again, we don't see an immediate effect in the way that it's leveling off, for example, here, the CO2 concentrations. We have exactly the same, just in the opposite way, for biodiversity. There's a much larger uncertainty in respect to the data available. But again, we have every 5 to 10 years, we have these international agreements. The last one is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, but it also shows that the time period to really bend the curve is becoming shorter and shorter. But if we are considering biodiversity, we also have to see that the time periods we are considering are too short. Primarily, we are looking on the last 40 years. The second is that there is a high unbalanced biodiversity research in respect to geographic regions, in respect to the different components of biodiversity as well. I will come back in a minute about this. The translation of data into information and knowledge, and finally into solutions options, is also not is stagnant. And finally, there is an increase. The increase in data and information is overwhelming. So these are some of the aspects that we are seeing. And just as a graphical way, the translation from data to information and knowledge, this is something, in particular, the translation of information to knowledge is one of the biggest kind of gaps that we are facing. We can call this an increase in knowledge in the dark, or dark knowledge, how we call it. And what you see, that we have a kind of exponential increase in data information. We would have a potential increase in a similar way of potential knowledge, but real knowledge doesn't increase in the same way. There's even kind of evidence that the individual knowledge is even decreasing in time. And there are several reasons for this kind of increasing gap between the real knowledge and the potential knowledge. Biased information, inaccessibility of data and information, incomprehensible data and information, loss of knowledge. Of course, what you see here is there is no kind of scales on the axis, because we are not able at the moment to really quantify this kind of increase of dark knowledge or knowledge in the dark. And it's a fundamental challenge for a society. How do we cope with knowledge that we need to have, but we don't have, or knowledge that we need and there's no interest to get this knowledge due to political, ideological, or economic reasons. Just a few ways forward. Here on the left side, you see the reasons for knowledge in the dark. Then you see some of the underlying reasons in academia, because this is something we can solve partly as well. We have loss of academic freedom. We have these biases. I just talked about this in respect to biodiversity. We have a lack of reproducibility. We have financial interests, biases by the authors. We have a scientific tower of Babel. It's becoming more and more in the jargon area, our scientific language. We have a loss of scientific disciplines, but there are also some possible ways forward. Open science, very different evaluation systems than we have at the moment. We are asking or suggesting International Court for Arbitration for Research, similar what is in sport available, advances in research synthesis and training next generations. I'm mentioning a second aspect or development that we have to consider, that we see an increasing privatization in research and development. I'm using here the OECD countries, selected OECD countries. The upper lines is the increase in funding through industry, and the lower one is the increase or the change development, which is public funding by the government. And we see there's a decline, a relative decline in funding by the government and an increase by industry. So we have an increasing privatization in respect to supporting research and development. And if you take all OECD countries, only 1/4 of all funding is by the public, is public funding. For example, the secret services in the US are investing more in research and development than France and Germany jointly together. So I think this is something that we have to consider as well when we are talking about open science and so on, because there's a lot of science that is produced with the goal not to become open. Now I'm coming back to biodiversity. I talked about that there are biases, because biodiversity in the public is species diversity. But of course, we have to consider genetic diversity, and the decline of genetic diversity is orders of magnitude higher or faster than the decline of species diversity. And this is just an example for crop species, potatoes, where we have about 5,000 gene variations at the global scale. And the story that most of you are aware about was in Ireland, where the food was at the end of the last century, or the mid of the last century, or the 19th century, was primarily dependent on one potato gene variation, the Irish lumper. And this created then, when there was a fungus coming from the America, and this was the potato blight, and this created the great famine, where 1 million people died and 1 million people emigrated within a very short period, within 5 years, primarily to the US. On the right hand, you see the human population of Ireland, and even 180 years later, we are still in the recovery phase from this major event. There's a lot that is done at the moment to conserve or preserve the genetic diversity of crop species, at least. And we have to do this because, for example, in Syria or in Afghanistan, all these crop storage facilities were destroyed during the war. And here you have this in Svalbard, this famous global seed vault. The second is also an aspect about species diversity and how species diversity is affecting human well-being. This is a European study, had been carried out by colleagues at Senckenberg, where about 40,000 people had been interviewed. And you see, in all cases, you see an increase in life satisfaction with an increase of bird species richness in your environment. And the 10% increase in bird species richness has a similar effect than a 10% increase in income for the people in respect to life satisfaction. So this is an important aspect that we have to consider as well if we are considering biodiversity. Now we are looking on birds, and there is another aspect that had been neglected in respect to biodiversity research, and this is behavioral diversity. We are looking on protection of areas, but we are not so much looking on the kind of connection of the different habitats, areas, protected areas, national parks, and so on. And this is a work that is primarily in collaboration. It's driven by people at the Max Planck Institute of Behavioral Ecology in Constant, together with Senckenberg and North Carolina. And it's just looking on the kind of global movement of species. Here you have storks, how they are migrating from Europe then across northern and eastern parts to Africa. And I think this is because you can track species in real time, you can have early warning systems. Here you see wildebeest in East Africa, how they are migrating in this area. You can zoom out again and you see and follow the kind of movement of bird species, storks here in this way to Southern Africa. Here you have buffalo, and then you see also kind of movement patterns of elephants in Botswana here. So this is something where we can, with behavioral ecology, we also have an early warning system because we can see what is happening or where we may have to react immediately in respect to changes in our environment. And animal movement and behavior is a unique form, so biologging data, unique form of remotely sensed biodiversity data. What we do have is somehow the pulse of life that we can measure. Its movement is a fundamental property of life, and animal behavior serves as an indicator to monitor, forecast, and manage ecosystem health. And we see that there are about 200,000 people who are at the moment logged at the global scale. And this is just one example where you see that the movement of species is negatively related, as we may expect, with the human footprint index. And recently, there had been a similar publication showing the effect of COVID-19 on the movement of organisms. Now I'm coming more on the ecosystem side and an area that I'm more familiar with, and this is the water system. We do have at the global scale enough fresh water, but it's uneven distributed in space. You see it here on this map, and in time. And it's becoming more and more uneven distributed, both in space and in time, due to climate change, due to overexploitation. How do we deal with this increasing uneven distribution of freshwater resources? We are primarily looking for engineering solutions. We build huge water transfer schemes, we build large dams, or we build desalination plants. So this is at the moment, there's a huge trust in engineering solutions for our rapidly changing availability of resources, here in this case of water. I'm just taking one example, and this is the construction of dams. This is the construction of dams over the last about 200 years. You see, and you notice graphs where we more or less have dammed almost all major rivers. The red dots are all these dams that are in the planning phase or in the construction phase. And a lot of these new dams, they are primarily located in ecologically extremely sensitive areas, like in the Amazon, Balkan area, Southeast Asia. If we construct all these large dams, then we will almost double the production of electricity out of hydropower. The question is not hydropower, yes or no, but the question is where to build them, how to build them, and how to operate these dams. And this is again a scientific challenge because we are asked to provide answers on this. We have also to be aware that freshwaters, if we separate biodiversity from climate change, then it could have detrimental effects on biodiversity. Hydropower is a renewable energy source, but it's by no way an environmentally friendly energy source. Here you see the Chinese paddlefish. This is the last photo of this species. It's extinct. it can become up to 4 or up to 7 meters long. It's one of these charismatic species, just gone. And we have done a work on this that we have seen in the last 45 years. The so-called freshwater megafauna declined by more than 90%. So within 40 years, sturgeons have survived 150 million years, and it took few generations now that they're at the brink of extinction. With this study, we even come to the front page of the New York Times. But it shows also that you only get this attention if it's probably too late even to really reverse some of these trends. So just in respect to the water cycle, we have what we may call the pandemic array of transformations in the water cycle. Mega projects built on self-confidence about technological progress. They're considered as a way to stimulate economic development or to demonstrate power. What we have is the so-called survival of the unfittest. There's an underestimation of the risks and an overestimation of the benefits. Otherwise, these projects, many of these projects would not be funded. Mega projects constrain the development of alternative options for future generations. We need a reference-based forecasting. And the question is if ecologically engineering nature-based solutions, if these are the solutions in respect to cope with this. What I am not showing today is we can even not imagine what kind of transformation we may see in the next decades in respect to modifying our hydrological or other resources at the global scale. But what we have seen is dramatic effects due to flood events. This is the so-called Ahrtal, Ahr Valley in Germany. It was 2 years ago, was one of the biggest flood events that caused, there were about 200 people who died, and the damage was 30 billions. And now they are rebuilding exactly the building at the same location where they had been destroyed, because otherwise they wouldn't get the money to rebuild it. And this is something where we see that it's not a very adaptive strategy exactly to rebuild the buildings at the same location. But there are other ways or alternative ways. This is from the Alpine Rhine at the border between Switzerland and Austria. Even here, the people that you see they are all living in former floodplains. And they calculated if there would be a similar flood event, then on the Ahr Valley that I have shown before, you would have about the same damages into some human lives. And so they had now about a 15 years planning phase, how to cope with this potential or increasing flood risks there. But again, we have to consider that if you take all the floodplains along the Rhine River, there are about 9 million people at the moment living on former inundation areas. And there's a huge economic benefit as well, because a lot of factories and so on are located in former inundation areas. So of course we have to protect the people there, and it requires technical constructions to protect them. But here on the Rhine River, they also went a different way. They improve, and this is the plan now, to improve the kind of ecological situation to provide additional room for the river. It would cost about 1.5 million for a 26-kilometer long section. But again, the time span, 15 years was the planning phase, and it will take 20 years for the construction and to realize this project. So 35 years for a 26-kilometer long sections in respect to flood control. But we also, it's not just the river itself, it's of course also the catchment area, the change of the kind of land use. Here you see on the left side the plantation, and on the right side a diverse forest. And by changing this land use, which takes time, again, of course, we are talking about decades, has a huge effect, for example, on water storage. Water storage of a monoculture is 60 to 75 liter per square meter, and it's 200 liter per square meter in a mixed forest as well. In addition, you have more carbon storage, you have higher recreational value, you have higher resistance and resilience of the system there as well. So, and then finally, if we use this catch, an increase in diversity may also reduce for example, the soil erosion on the left hand. If you take the root system, you have screws and nails and so on, and they protect the soil from becoming eroded. In Germany, we are investing quite a lot in environmental protection. It's about 76 billion per year that is invested. But 94% of this is for wastewater management, waste management, and the removal of environmental damages. So less than 6% of all investments are for prevention. 94% is to removing the kind of effects of our management. We have exactly the same for the human health system. It's exactly less than 6% is for prevention, 94% is for healing. And then in addition, we have not only the 71 billion that is for wastewater management and the removal of environmental pollution. At the same time, we have 60 billion a year on environmental on subsidies that have an environmental damaging effect. So in the water sector, but not in the water sector alone, we have this kind of impair and then repair water, and this is the dominant approach to human water security. It's not a very sustainable approach. Now I'm just coming to the end. I have some remarks. Just the first one is many alterations, we will not be able to reverse them, and they will shape our planets for thousands to millions of years. The second is we need the systemic approaches. The challenges are too complex and they require an integrative approach in both research and application. For example, linking flood control and freshwater conservation. This is something where in Switzerland they changed the flood control measures over the last 10 years and going for sustainable land use planning and for combining flood control and conservation. We need innovative concepts in conservation and management. The kind of almost romantic view in conserving our nature will not help in the long term. We need noble ecosystems, and communities require fundamentally different strategies in ecosystem conservation and environmental management. For example, in the freshwater system, we have to look for hybrid solutions, where we are looking on coupling the services of technical and natural systems in a wise way. And of course, and this is not something it's maybe trivial, that the humans are responsible for the conditions of our planet, but we also must push and advance a fundamental transformation towards a safe and just corridor. And this requires a transdisciplinary approach. Triple loop learning is something like this. Now I'm coming to my final slide. We have this joint challenge. We have the society and we have the science, the kind of co-design, we have the co-production, we have the co-dissemination. Then we have the societal discourse, we have the scientific discourse, we have and then at the end we have to combine this and we have to link this, and we need a different kind of science economy as well, where we integrate and combine different knowledge systems in order to develop transformations for our environment on our planet. Thank you so much for your attention.